Welcomes to Let Me In podcast. Health and politics, games being played by big tech.
If you are concerned about chemicals in our food, like glyphosate or weed killer, also called Roundup, which is on 70% of our food, and has been linked to so many health-related diseases like cancer and other microbiome issues, then this information is for you. Let's get started.
You can't sue the producer of a toxic chemical until science on that chemical and that particular association and the particular harm reaches a certain threshold.
When you Google glyphosate, this is what comes up, and when you scroll down, FDA and EPA all endorses its use. But why?
Just very carefully talk about glyphosate, which apparently affects only plants and not human cells. So I really want you to go through that. That was the messaging that opened the door for glyphosate being safe for one and all. Let's use it around the globe. Let's modify the seeds to make them Roundup resistant because glyphosate doesn't affect human cells.
Right, I mean, that was the line that we were given, and that sounds so beautiful. We don't have the pathway, we don't have the enzyme. So there's a specific enzyme, a specific biological pathway, really important to basically all the plants. And we don't have any of that in our cells. They don't have the genes for it. They can't make that protein. So how can we possibly be affected by glyphosate? It's so wonderful because it's specific to this plant enzyme that we don't have. And of course, what you overlook is that our gut microbes have that enzyme, use that enzyme to make essential amino acids for us, the aromatic amino acids, which are so important, not just for building proteins, which of course would be enough already, but they're also the precursors to so many important biologically active molecules, including all the neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, melatonin, the skin tanning agent, melanin, thyroid hormone, B vitamins, and then there's also all kinds of exotic molecules that the plants make that are beneficial to our health. When you eat a plant-based diet, you get all these wonderful polyphenols and flavonoids. Those things all come out of that pathway too. So it messes up the nutritional value of the foods that we eat. And then it also messes up our gut microbiome, which then disturbs so much of our metabolism, and then we just get completely out of whack.
Listen to another take on glyphosate and how it is used in so many of our common food.
About the farm system, what's wrong with it, and glyphosate is really at the center of that conversation because it is a weed killer that's used on farms to prevent weeds growth, particularly around GMO soy crops and many other crops. It's incredible blockbuster chemical from agriculture. It's been used all over the world. In fact, according to the EPA, 220 million pounds of Roundup, which is glyphosate, were used just in 2015. In California alone, there's more than 10 million pounds used every year. It's the world's most commonly used herbicide. It accounts for 72% of all pesticides and agricultural chemicals around the world. And since 1974, we've put on 1.6 billion kilograms, more than 3.5 billion pounds on crops in the United States alone. It's on 70 different food crops, including corn, soy, canola, wheat. So if you eat a slice of bread, a bowl of Cheerios, a sushi roll, a plate of pasta, a slice of pizza, a chicken nugget, there's a good chance one or more of its ingredients was doused in Roundup or weed killer before it left the farm. In fact, Cheerios have more glyphosate per serving than vitamin D and vitamin B12, which are added to enrich the cereal. It's even been in commercial honey. So it's a big problem. It's linked to cancer. It's linked to all these health issues. So Bobby, take us back to the origins of glyphosate and how it's become such a prevalent chemical and
Glyphosate history.
But at some point in glyphosate's history, somebody had thrown a bucket of it out in the lawn and noticed that it killed everything. And Monsanto took a look at that and said, we can make an herbicide of that. During the first decade of its use, it was a conventional herbicide. Farm workers would strap a tank of glyphosate onto their backs, and they would go through the cornfields.
Yeah.
In the early days, right after the planting, when the weeds were the same side, were competing with the corn saplings, and they would spray the weeds and kill the weeds to give the corn time to grow high enough so the weeds could no longer compete.
Yeah.
The spraying took place very, very early in the season before there was any food on that plant.
Yeah.
And then in 2000 or in 1994, and Monsanto or glyphosate was not a particularly noteworthy herbicide at that time. It had many, many competitors in the marketplace. And something changed in 1994, which was that Monsanto introduced Roundup Ready corn. And what had happened is they would spray some. They were dumping they were dumping the glyphosate or the Roundup out in the grass. At one point, they noticed that there was a weed that was not being killed, and they said, that weed is immune to glyphosate.
Yeah.
Let's take a gene out of that weed, put it in corn, and make the corn immune to glyphosate. And that was really the first big GMO crop.
Yeah.
And now you could fire all those farm workers, and you could fly an airplane spraying pesticides and saturate the entire landscape with just one guy.
Yeah.
And everything would die except for the Roundup Ready corn.
Yeah.
And it changed the face of agriculture across the planet. Within a few years, most of the corn was Roundup Ready corn. Virtually all corn grown today is, 95, 98% of it is Roundup Ready corn. It's Roundup. It's Monsanto's corn.
Yeah. They sell the seeds and they sell the herbicides. It's a closed circuit.
It's a closed circuit, and they also implant in the seed. They've done other genetic manipulations that creates a plant that reflects the sunlight, certain spectrums of light. You can actually fly a plane over the cornfields with a special camera, which is what Monsanto does. They can photograph it, and they can know from the air which are Roundup Ready corn and which corn is natural corn. And they have a list of all the people who have paid for their corn. And if you're a farmer and you happen to have their crop on your property and you haven't paid for it, then they sue you. And that's right. One of the things that makes them very notorious. Those lawsuits against individual farmers, a lot of times they've got Roundup corn on their property because of drift. Because the corn drifted onto their property, but it's not what they bought.
Wait.
Roundup is associated with all kinds of illnesses, right? With gluten allergies, with celiac disease, with non-alcoholic fatty liver cancer, with colon cancers, with kidney cancers, and with many, many other problems. But you can't sue somebody. You can't sue the producer of a toxic chemical until science on that chemical and that particular association and the particular harm reaches a certain threshold.
Yeah.
And that's called Daubert. It's a federal rule, and most of the states have rules that follow Daubert. And what Daubert says is, the purpose of Daubert is they don't want somebody coming in and going to a jury and saying, that this perfume made me insane.
Right.
Because they want to make sure that there's enough science that you can't just bring a weird theory or a marginal theory into
it's a level of evidence that
to the jury and have the jury decide on that. So the judge has to say that the science on this is actually mainstream enough. It has passed this threshold that I'm going to allow you to explain this to the jury.
Yeah.
And so we couldn't sue Monsanto, even though we all knew it's causing all these problems. We couldn't sue them on it until 2015. Because in 2015, the IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, I just stop for a second and tell you who IARC is. IARC is an agency back in I think it was the 70s. People realized that a lot of things were carcinogenic. They were increasing your risk of cancer. And the different countries were regulating them all differently. And they were regulating them different different substances and different compounds, different elements, and they were regulating them with varying degrees of good science. Well, the major Western countries said, none of us really has the capacity to get round up all the science in the world and the best scientists and figure out what's carcinogenic and what isn't. So let's create all of us together.
That's part of the WHO, is that right?
Yeah, and we'll create an agency, and they ended up headquartering it in France. And every year it looks at certain associations, at certain vectors. For example, it might look at coffee one year, it might look at cell phones one year, it might look at PCBs, or whatever, or tetrachloroethylene, or polyaromatic hydrocarbons, or any compound. And it will bring in the best scientists in the world in that area from every country in the world. And it will assemble all of the literature on that association, and it will have them read all of that literature. There may be 1,000 studies, and then make a determination about whether it's a definite carcinogen, whether it's a probable carcinogen, a possible carcinogen, in both, or not a carcinogen, in both animals and human beings.
Yeah.
It looks at the animal studies separately, and it looks at the human studies separately, recognizing that just because something causes cancer in animals,
it's not necessarily a problem.
it doesn't necessarily cause humans. And in order to make the determination that it's a probable carcinogen in humans, you need both the animal studies, the mechanistic studies, like petri dishes, etc., and then you need the epidemiological studies, which are the human population studies. And it takes a lot of science to get to the point where IARC will say that's a probable carcinogen. And that happened in 2015.
For glyphosate.
For glyphosate, but with only one association, which was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Even though we have a pretty good idea it's causing many, 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 many other problems.
Yes.
And there's really strong science on those other problems. None of them had hit the threshold where we could take it to a jury. And just because IARC says it is not enough, the judge has to make an independent determination. Now, even though, the agencies all over the world take what IARC say as gospel, for example, in California, there's a law called Prop 65, which says that anything that's carcinogenic has to be labeled as such at the place where you purchase it. And the way they determine what is carcinogenic, what it isn't, is what IARC says. So if IARC says something's a probable carcinogen, it has to be labeled in California. And there are at least 10 nations and probably 50 jurisdictions around the world that do the same thing, that say whatever IARC says, that
and just go with their word. Yeah.
But still, the judges in this country are not allowed to say whatever IARC says passes part of the microbiome. It's the way that the microbiome essentially communicates with itself. And, one of the things that Monsanto said from the beginning is that glyphosate is safe because it doesn't interfere with any human system or organ. But that was before we understood the importance of the microbiome, which is actually our largest and probably our most important organ. I mean, the brain is important, the heart is important, but the microbiome is the largest organ, and without the shikimate pathway, it simply doesn't function.
So this is something I don't think people realize. I mean, yes, they've heard of the cancer-glyphosate connection, but people don't understand that glyphosate is toxic to the microbiome.
Yeah.
And it's small amounts can have a big impact. And just for example, the Impossible Burger, which is a GMO soy burger, has 10 times the amount of glyphosate that's needed to destroy your microbiome in animal studies. And we're seeing, like you said, increases in celiac expression, because 35% of people have the celiac gene, but not everybody gets it. 1% usually get it, but the rate of celiac has gone up 400% in the last 50 years, and the rate of gluten sensitivity has gone dramatically up. And it's in part, perhaps because it's destroying our microbiome, and we get changes in the gut flora, which lead to leaky gut, and then the gluten starts to create problems.